What would you do if the world decided your worth could be measured in dollars? In a forgotten corner of the Wild West, a fragile widow stands on the edge of losing everything, her dignity, her freedom, even her future, until a silent giant steps forward with an unexpected choice that will change both their lives forever. Stay with this story, because what begins as a simple transaction quickly unfolds into something far deeper, something that challenges everything we believe about strength, justice, and humanity.
The wind bit hard in Laramie. It howled through the warped boards of the stagecoach way station. It carried the smell of dry dirt, the smell of cheap tobacco, and the sharp, bitter stench of desperation. Clara Hayes stood on the edge of the wooden porch. She was 28 years old, a widow for exactly 9 days, and small, barely 4 feet and 11 inches in her scuffed leather boots. Her black morning dress hung loose on her frame. The fabric was stiff with trail dust. Her hands were numb from the Wyoming chill. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury, and Clara couldn't afford luxuries. Not anymore. Her husband, Thomas, was a good man, an idealistic schoolteacher. He packed their life into a wagon, wanting to build a school out in the Oregon Territory. He packed books. He packed hope. But a wagon trail fever took him somewhere near the border. It took his life. It left her stranded. And it left her with a stack of debts. $40 for medical supplies, a wooden coffin, and 2 weeks of room and board. $40. Out here in the middle of nowhere, it might as well have been $1 million. The station master, a sweaty, heavy-set man named Miller, tapped his thick ledger. He didn't look at Clara's face. He looked at her the way a rancher looks at a horse at an auction block, calculating, cold. A crowd had gathered around the porch. Drifters, unshaven ranch hands, men with hard eyes and cruel mouths waiting for the morning stage. $40 is the total debt, Miller announced. He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dirt. Who's taking the contract? She can work it off. Work it off. The phrase was a polite lie. Everyone on the porch knew it. You didn't work off a debt at a way station. You were owned until they broke you. A man stepped to the front of the crowd. Griggs. He ran a saloon and a boarding house down in Cheyenne, the kind of place where women went in and didn't leave until they were dead. He looked Clara up and down. He smirked. Not much meat to her, Griggs said loudly. He picked his teeth with a splinter of wood. Tiny little thing. Don't look like she could lift a heavy wash bucket. What good is she? The men chuckled. It was a low, ugly sound. I'll give you $30, Miller, Griggs offered. He hooked his thumbs into his gun belt. Put her in a tight corset. She might fetch a dime or two from the desperate ones down south. Clara's hands shook. She hid them deep in the folds of her black skirt. She dug her fingernails into her own palms until it hurt. She kept her chin high. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of her terror. Miller frowned. Debt is 40, Griggs. Book says 40. She ain't worth 40. Heavy boots hit the wooden steps. The sound was different, slow, deliberate, heavy enough to make the porch beams groan. The crowd parted. They didn't want to move, but they did. Pure instinct made them step aside. Gideon Vance walked into the morning light. He blotted out the sun. 6 feet and 5 inches of solid muscle and heavy bone. A thick canvas coat stretched across shoulders as wide as an axe handle. His face was weathered leather, scarred from the harsh wind, scarred from a past nobody talked about. But they talked about him. Oh, they talked. Well, look here, Griggs sneered. He took a step back but kept his voice loud. It's dumb Vance. A few men laughed, louder this time, emboldened by the safety of the crowd. The mute giant, another man called out from the back. Lose your way to the pasture, Vance? Got the brains of a peanut. Griggs stepped closer, puffing out his chest to look bigger. What do you know about buying a woman, Vance? You couldn't even talk to her, just grunt at her like the dumb beast you are. Gideon didn't flinch. He didn't clench his fists. He didn't reach for a gun. He just looked at Griggs. A flat, empty stare. The kind of stare that made a man feel very, very small. He walked past Griggs, ignored him completely. He stopped right in front of Miller. Clara looked up. She had to crane her neck just to see his face. He was a mountain of a man, terrifying in his sheer size. But his eyes, they weren't cruel. They were tired, deeply, deeply tired. Gideon reached into his heavy coat. He pulled out a worn leather pouch. He didn't speak, he didn't grunt. He opened the pouch. He placed 4 gold eagle coins on the ledger. Clink, 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 clink. Exactly $40. Miller stared at the gold. He swallowed hard. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. Sold to Vance. Griggs's face turned a mottled red. You stupid ox. You just wasted good gold on a half-sized widow who can't even plow a field. Gideon didn't look at him. He pulled a small slate chalkboard from his belt. He took a piece of white chalk from his pocket. He wrote quickly. His handwriting wasn't clumsy. It was elegant, flowing. He handed a folded piece of paper to Clara. Then he handed her a heavy iron key. Clara unfolded the paper. It was a standard indentured labor contract. But under the section for duties, he had crossed out all the usual terms with a thick line of ink. He had written one word next to it. Bookkeeper. He didn't want a maid. He didn't want a saloon girl. He wanted someone to read and write. He tapped his small chalkboard. She read his neat script. Room, board, protection, 6 months. Then you are free to go. Griggs spat on the ground near Clara's boots. He gave a nasty, mocking grin. Well, little widow, enjoy being the giant's new property. Hope he don't break you in half when he gets bored. The crowd snickered. They waited to see the tiny woman cower. They waited to see her cry. Clara didn't cry. She tightened her grip on the iron key. The cold metal bit into her palm. It grounded her. It sparked a fire in her chest that Thomas had placed there years ago. She turned around. She didn't look at Gideon. She looked dead center at Griggs. She looked at the whole crowd of sneering, ignorant men. She took a deep breath. Her voice rang out, clear, unshaking, like a church bell on a quiet morning. Poverty might strip a person of their property, Clara stated. Her words sliced straight through the howling wind. But no man has the right to strip them of their dignity. The laughter stopped. A few men shifted nervously on their feet. I am an employee, Clara continued, her voice rising, demanding they hear every single syllable. I am not a slave, and I am certainly not property. Human rights are not cancelled simply because I am a widow without a dime. Equality and respect are not items you can buy or sell at a way station. She took one step toward Griggs. He actually took a half step back. You measure a man's worth by his compassion, she said, her voice shaking with absolute conviction. You measure him by how he treats the vulnerable, not by how loud he mocks them. And today, the only civilized human being standing on this porch is the man you just called a beast. Silence. Heavy and absolute. Griggs opened his mouth. But no words came out. He just stared at the tiny woman in the dusty black dress. Gideon stood perfectly still. He looked down at her. His eyes widened, just a fraction. But for a man who never showed anything, it was an earthquake. No one had ever defended him, not in years, and definitely not a woman who barely reached his chest. He looked at her small, trembling shoulders. He looked at her fierce, blazing eyes. He gently touched the brim of his hat to her, a silent sign of absolute respect. He turned toward his waiting wagon. He didn't grab her arm. He didn't tell her to follow. He just left the space open for her, letting her choose. Clara lifted her chin. She walked through the crowd. The men stepped back. They gave her room, not because of the giant waiting at the wagon, because of her. The ride out of Laramie took 3 days. 3 days of bone-rattling wagon ruts. 3 days of sweeping, endless gray plains. The wind never stopped. It pushed against the canvas cover of the wagon. It bit through Clara's thin woolen coat. Gideon drove the team. He sat on the bench, a mountain of canvas and leather. He didn't speak. He didn't hum. He just watched the horizon. Clara watched him. She sat on the wooden seat beside him. She kept a respectful distance. She didn't know this man. She knew his gold was good. She knew his eyes were tired. That was all. They reached the ranch on the fourth afternoon. It wasn't beautiful. It was a fortress, a low, heavy stone house built to survive the Wyoming winters. The timber was thick. The fences were high. Everything was built for utility, built for survival. Gideon pulled the horses to a halt. He secured the brake. He stepped down. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't think she wanted to be touched. He just pointed to the heavy oak door. Clara climbed down. Her legs ached. She walked to the door and pushed it open. Inside it was cold, but it was clean, spotlessly, ruthlessly clean. She walked into the kitchen, and immediately she understood the problem. This house was not built for a woman. It was not built for a normal man. It was built for a giant. The heavy wooden counter came up to her chest. The cast-iron skillet hanging on the wall was the size of a wagon wheel. The tin cups were stacked on a shelf that hovered a full foot above her fingertips, even if she stood on her toes. She sighed. A quiet, exhausted sound. She was 4 feet and 11 inches of tired bone. She dragged a heavy wooden dining chair over to the counter. The chair screeched against the floorboards. She hiked up her black skirts. She climbed onto the chair. She reached for a tin cup. The front door opened, the wind howled in, then the door clicked shut. Gideon stood in the entryway. He held an armful of split firewood. He stopped. He looked at Clara. She was balancing precariously on the chair, her hand wrapped around a simple tin cup. She froze. She felt a sudden hot flush of embarrassment. She was an intruder in his giant world, a nuisance. Gideon didn't laugh. He didn't shake his head. He walked to the wood stove. He set the wood down, quietly, gently. Then he turned and walked right back out the front door. Clara climbed down. She poured water from the pitcher. She drank in silence. She wondered if she had angered him. An hour passed. The sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks. From the shed outside, she heard a sound. The steady, rhythmic drag of a handsaw. Ursh, ursh, ursh. Then the precise, heavy strike of a hammer. The door opened again. Gideon stepped inside. He carried a wooden box. No, not a box. A step stool. It was made of fresh pine. The edges were sanded perfectly smooth. There were no rough splinters. It was heavy, sturdy, built to last a lifetime. He walked to the kitchen counter. He placed the stool on the floor. He tapped it once with the toe of his heavy leather boot, ensuring it wouldn't wobble. Then he looked at her. He gave a single short nod. He turned around and went back outside. A few minutes later, he brought in another one. He placed it by the wash basin. Clara stared at the smooth pine wood. She reached out. She traced the grain of the wood with her fingers. He didn't make a joke about her size. He didn't offer to fetch things for her, treating her like a helpless child. He just gave her the tools to reach his world, to stand on her own 2 feet. It was the kindest thing a man had ever done for her. 2 weeks passed. They fell into a rhythm, a quiet, steady dance of survival. She cooked, she cleaned. She took over the ledgers. Gideon worked the land. He fixed fences. He chopped wood. He left the house before dawn and returned long after dusk. He communicated only through his small slate chalkboard. Short, practical commands. Need nails. Salt for the horses. Winter is coming. One Tuesday, a storm blew in. The rain lashed against the stone walls. Gideon was trapped in the barn with a sick foal. Clara was trapped in the house. She was looking for a fresh bottle of ink. She walked into the small back room. Gideon's room. She had avoided it, respecting his privacy. But she needed ink to finish the supply orders. The room was sparse, a heavy iron bed, a wool blanket, a small cast-iron stove, and a desk. On the desk, there were books. Clara stopped. She stepped closer. There were no cheap penny dreadfuls here, no farming almanacs. She ran her fingers over the worn leather spines. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. The Republic by Plato, a thick volume of Ralph Waldo Emerson, a collection of poetry. These were not the books of a dumb beast. These were the books of a scholar. Next to the book sat a stack of leather-bound journals. The top one was open. Clara knew she shouldn't look, but she did. The handwriting was breathtaking. It wasn't just neat. It was art. Flowing script, written with a steady, practiced hand. She read a single paragraph on the open page. It was a philosophical reflection on the nature of guilt, on the heavy, suffocating weight of silence. A man who swallows his words does not starve, Gideon had written. He drowns in them. Clara stepped back. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The town of Laramie had called him a mute giant, a dim-witted ox, and he let them. He let them mock him. He let them cheat him, because he was punishing himself. The silence wasn't a defect. It was a prison sentence, a sentence he had handed down to himself. That evening, the storm finally broke. Gideon came inside. He was soaked to the bone. He smelled of wet wool and rain. He dried off. He sat at the heavy dining table. Clara brought him a plate of hot stew. She sat across from him. She didn't bring her mending. She didn't bring the ledger. She looked at him, straight into those tired, scarred eyes. "I went into your room today," she said. Her voice was steady. "I was looking for ink." Gideon stopped eating. He put his spoon down. He didn't look angry, just utterly, completely still. "I saw the books, Gideon," she said. "I saw the journals." He looked down at his scarred hands. He reached for his chalkboard. Clara reached out. She placed her small hand flat over the slate, stopping him. "No," she said softly. "Don't write. Just listen." He slowly raised his eyes. "The men in Laramie called you stupid. They called you a beast. And you let them. You hide behind this massive frame of yours. You hide behind this chalk." She leaned forward. Her eyes burned with fierce conviction. "Your silence isn't a weakness," Clara said, her voice ringing clear in the quiet room. "I know you are punishing yourself for something in your past. I can read it in your eyes. But remember, self-flagellation offers no value to society." Gideon stared at her. His chest rose and fell with a heavy breath. "We only truly heal," she continued, speaking the words like a vow, "when we use the rest of our lives to protect others rather than hiding from the truth. You cannot pay a debt to the past by letting the present mock you. You are a brilliant, capable man. Do not let ignorant men define the space you take up in this world." Gideon looked at her hand, resting on his chalkboard. So small, so fragile, yet holding down the only defense he had left. He didn't pull the board away. He slowly turned his hand over. He let his scarred, calloused fingers lightly brush against the back of her hand. A gentle, fleeting touch. An acknowledgement. A surrender. He picked up his spoon. He resumed eating. The silence in the room was no longer a heavy, suffocating thing. It was just quiet. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like peace. Spring was trying to break through the Wyoming frost. It was a violent struggle. The ground thawed during the day, turning the roads into thick, sucking mud. Then it froze at night, leaving deep, jagged ruts that could snap a wagon wheel in half. They needed supplies, salt, flour, nails for the south pasture fence. The ride into town took 2 hours. The town was called Oak Haven. It was a miserable collection of false front buildings, a saloon, a mercantile, and a sheriff's office that was mostly for show. The real law in Oak Haven was Silas Thorne. Thorne was a cattle baron. He owned the bank, he owned the sheriff, he owned the fears of the townspeople. He operated on a simple rule. Everything had a price, and everyone had a breaking point. Gideon pulled the wagon up to the mercantile. He set the brake. Clara climbed down. She held her skirts up to avoid the mud. Gideon walked beside her, a massive, silent shadow. They stepped onto the wooden boardwalk. 3 men were leaning against the front of the store. They wore expensive leather dusters. They wore silver spurs that jingled when they shifted their weight. Silas Thorne's hired guns. The leader was a man named Pike. He had a face like a hatchet and a cruel, easy smile. Pike spat a sunflower seed onto the boardwalk, right in front of Clara's boots. "Well, look what the mud dragged in," Pike drawled. He didn't look at Clara, he looked right at Gideon. "It's the dumb beast," Pike said loudly. He wanted the street to hear. "Hey, Vance, you lose your grazing pasture? You wandering into town looking for a master?" The other two men laughed. A sharp, ugly sound. Gideon didn't stop walking. He kept his eyes straight ahead. He moved toward the door of the mercantile. Pike stepped directly into his path. "I'm talking to you, Ox," Pike sneered. Gideon stopped. He was a full head taller than Pike. He outweighed the man by 80 pounds. He could have broken Pike's neck with one twist of his scarred hands. He just stood there, patient, waiting. Pike didn't like the silence. It made him look small. It made him angry. Pike shoved him, hard. Two hands right in the center of Gideon's chest. Gideon was caught off guard. His boot slipped on the wet, slick wood of the boardwalk. He fell backward. He crashed off the walkway. He landed flat on his back in the street, right in the deep, freezing, filthy mud. The street went quiet. People stopped walking. Everyone watched. Pike laughed. "Look at him, can't even stand on 2 feet, dumb animal." Clara gasped. Her blood ran hot. A blinding, furious rage spiked in her chest. She stepped forward, her fists clenched at her sides. She was ready to tear Pike's eyes out, but Gideon raised a hand, a single, muddy hand, a command to stop. He didn't scramble up. He didn't roar in anger. He moved slowly, deliberately. He got to his feet. Mud dripped from his heavy canvas coat. It smeared across his face. He stood in the street, a giant covered in filth. He looked at Pike. He didn't reach for the heavy Colt revolver on his hip. He didn't clench his fists. He just looked at the man with that same bone-deep weariness. Then he turned around. He walked to the water trough. He washed the mud from his face. He took a rag from the wagon. He wiped his hands. He walked back to Clara. He gestured to the door of the store. "After you." Clara was trembling. Her jaw was locked so tight her teeth ached. She wanted to scream at the town. She wanted to scream at Gideon to fight back. But she looked into his eyes. There was no cowardice there. There was a terrifying, absolute control. She swallowed her rage. She lifted her chin. She walked past the laughing men and into the store. The ride back to the ranch was agonizing. Clara sat on the wagon seat. Her arms were crossed tight over her chest. The anger was a physical weight. It burned in her throat. Gideon drove in silence. His coat was ruined. The mud had dried into a stiff gray crust. They reached the edge of the property line as the sun began to set. The sky was bruised purple and orange. A figure was standing by the wooden gate. It was an older man. His skin was the color of worn copper. His hair was long, braided with gray. He wore a mix of traditional buckskin and a faded Army-issue wool coat. It was Thomas, the Native American elder. Gideon pulled the wagon to a halt. He didn't reach for his rifle. He nodded to Thomas. A slow, respectful dip of the head. Thomas nodded back. He didn't look at the mud on Gideon's coat. He looked at Clara. Clara climbed down from the wagon. She needed to walk. She needed to let the anger out before it choked her. She walked over to the fence. Thomas stood on the other side. "They shoved him in the mud," Clara said. Her voice shook. The words spilled out before she could stop them. 3 men. They called him a beast. They shoved him into the filth in front of the whole town. Thomas looked at the horizon. The wind lifted a strand of his gray hair. "And he did not strike back," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "No," Clara said bitterly. "He just took it. Why? Why do they treat him like that? He is twice the man any of them are. He is smart. He is kind. Why do they hate him so much?" Thomas turned his dark, ancient eyes to her. "Men fear what is massive and beyond their control," Thomas said. His voice was deep, resonant, and calm. "They look at his size. They look at his silence. And they see a mirror reflecting their own weakness. So they use mockery to disguise their own inferiority. Clara gripped the wooden fence rail. It isn't fair. It isn't right. He should fight them. He should show them he isn't a coward. Thomas shook his head slowly. True equality isn't about who is physically stronger, Thomas said, speaking the words with the heavy weight of a man who had seen too much war. It is not about who can draw a gun the fastest, or who can throw the hardest punch. Violence only creates a hierarchy of brutality. He pointed a weathered finger toward Gideon, who was quietly unhitching the horses, ignoring the mud caked on his skin. Equality is found, Thomas stated clearly, his voice carrying over the whistling Wyoming wind, when the strong choose to restrain their fists out of compassion. That man is not a coward, Clara. It takes far more strength to absorb the hatred of the world and refuse to return it than it does to break a man's jaw. He is protecting his soul, and by not fighting, he is protecting theirs. Clara stood by the fence. The anger in her chest slowly began to recede. It was replaced by a profound, overwhelming ache. She looked back at Gideon, the giant cowboy, covered in mud, silent, unbroken. She realized Thomas was right. Gideon wasn't hiding from the town. He was enduring them, bearing their cruelty because he knew he was strong enough to carry it without breaking. Clara walked back to the wagon. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She walked up to Gideon. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out her own clean white handkerchief. She stood on her tiptoes. She reached up, and very gently she wiped a stray streak of dried mud from his scarred cheek. Gideon froze. He stopped unhitching the horse. He looked down at her. Clara looked back. "I'll boil some water," she said softly. "Let's get you clean." Gideon didn't nod. But as Clara walked toward the heavy stone house, the giant stood in the yard, his hand resting lightly against his cheek, where she had touched him. The rain started on a Tuesday. It did not stop. It was not a gentle rain. It was a Wyoming downpour. The sky turned the color of bruised iron. The wind drove the water sideways. It hit the stone walls of the ranch house like handfuls of gravel. 4 days of it. The ground could not drink anymore. The earth turned to thick, heavy soup. Gideon and Clara worked side by side. They didn't talk. There was no time. They tied ropes around their waists. They waded into the muck. They guided the panicked horses to higher ground. Clara slipped in the mud. Gideon caught her. His massive hand gripped her arm. He pulled her upright. He didn't let go until she found her footing. They were exhausted, soaked to the bone, breathing hard in the freezing rain. Then they heard the sound. It started low, a deep, wet rumble. It sounded like the mountain itself was groaning. Gideon whipped his head around. He looked past the barn, the ridge, the steep hill of dirt and scrub brush that guarded the north property line. It was moving. "Get back!" Gideon signaled with a violent wave of his arm. Clara ran. She scrambled onto the sturdy wooden porch. The ridge gave way. The mudslide came down in a heavy black wave. It crashed into the back wall of the barn. The thick pine timbers groaned under the weight. They cracked, but they held. Then the water began to wash the loose dirt away. The rain poured over the fresh scar in the earth. It washed away a thick layer of topsoil. It revealed a hollow space beneath the hill, a depression in the ground that had been deliberately buried. Gideon stood in the rain. He stared at the washed-out hill. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared. Clara watched him from the porch. She saw his broad shoulders slump. The strength seemed to drain right out of him. He looked like a man who had just been shot in the chest. She stepped off the porch. She walked through the driving rain. She stood beside him. She looked at the mud. At first she saw only rocks, white rocks, jagged and long. But as the rain washed the mud away, the shapes became clear. They were bones, not a few, dozens, hundreds, tangled together in a mass grave. Clara gasped. She covered her mouth with both hands. Among the bones, other shapes emerged. A rusted iron cooking pot, a child's leather moccasin preserved in the thick clay. And scattered throughout the dirt, glinting dull yellow in the rain, were brass buttons. Buttons stamped with the insignia of the United States Cavalry. Gideon dropped to his knees. The mud splashed up around him. He didn't care. He fell forward. He planted his scarred hands in the freezing muck. He bowed his head. His massive shoulders shook. He wasn't crying. It was worse than crying. It was a silent, agonizing collapse. The dam had broken. The past had washed up to his front door. Clara didn't run. She didn't scream. She walked into the mud. She knelt beside the giant. She reached into his heavy canvas coat. She found his small slate chalkboard. She found his piece of chalk. She placed them on the ground between his hands. The rain immediately began to wash the slate clean. "Tell me," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, steady. Gideon stared at the slate. His hand hovered over the chalk. He was trembling. A man who could lift a wagon by himself was shaking like a leaf. He picked up the chalk. He pressed so hard the piece snapped in two. He used the broken half. He wrote in large, jagged letters. 1876. I was a scout. He paused. He wiped the rain away. He wrote again. My commander ordered the relocation, Thomas's people. We forced them into a canyon. No water, no game. Winter came early. Gideon stopped. He squeezed his eyes shut. The rain ran down his face like tears. He finished the sentence. They died. All of them. I led them there. I dug this pit. Clara read the words. The rain hit the board, blurring the chalk, but the meaning was clear. The horror was absolute. She looked at the pit. She looked at the giant man kneeling in the mud. The town of Laramie thought he was dumb. They thought he was a brute. They were wrong. He was a soldier who had followed an evil order, and the guilt had crushed his voice. It had driven him into exile. He had bought the very land where the bodies were buried, to stand guard, to punish himself forever. Clara reached out. She placed her hand under his chin. She forced him to look up. She forced him to look into her eyes. Do you condemn yourself for this? Clara asked. Gideon looked at her. His eyes were wide, haunted, begging for judgment. He reached for the chalk again. He wanted to write it. It was safer to write it. Clara pulled the board away. She tossed it into the mud. No, she said. No more chalk. No more hiding. Do you condemn yourself? Gideon opened his mouth. His jaw worked. His chest heaved. He drew in a ragged, desperate breath. His throat was tight from years of silence. The muscles strained. The effort was agonizing. He forced the sound out, a deep, broken rumble that tore from the very bottom of his soul. Guilty. One word. The first word she had ever heard him speak. It sounded like tearing iron. He collapsed forward again, waiting for her to leave. Waiting for her to look at him with the same disgust he felt for himself. Clara didn't move away. She shifted closer. She sank deeper into the mud. She gripped his heavy canvas collar. She pulled him up until they were eye to eye. The rain poured over them both. Listen to me, Clara said. Her voice cut through the sound of the storm. Admitting your wrongs is the first step toward redemption. Do you hear me? Gideon stared at her. No human being is flawless, Gideon, Clara continued. She spoke the words clearly, deliberately, refusing to let the wind carry them away. A man's worth isn't measured by whether he has fallen. It is measured by his courage to face his darkest shadows and start anew. She pointed to the pit of bones. You did not order their deaths. You were a soldier, but you hid the truth. You buried it, and you buried yourself with it. She looked back into his eyes. True respect begins with respecting the truth. You cannot hide from this anymore. We are going to make this right. Not by silence, but by action. Gideon looked at the small woman, covered in mud, soaking wet, holding him together by sheer force of will. He didn't speak again. He didn't have to. He reached out. He rested his massive, calloused hand over her small hands gripping his collar. He closed his eyes. He nodded, once, a solemn vow. The rain kept falling, But the ghosts in the ground were finally awake, and Gideon Vance was finally done hiding. November brought the snow. December brought the ice. By the first week of January, the Wyoming Territory was dead. The world was a blinding, freezing white. The wind was no longer just air. It was a physical weapon. It scoured the plains. It killed anything left outside. The stone ranch house was a fortress. Gideon had chopped a mountain of firewood in the fall. The wood stove burned day and night. The heavy iron radiated heat. It kept the small living space warm while the frost crept up the inside of the glass windows. They lived in a quiet rhythm. Clara baked bread. She mended clothes. She read her late husband's books by the firelight. Gideon carved wood. He oiled harnesses. He sat in his heavy chair, whittling small, delicate figures out of pine. Horses, birds. He left them on the kitchen counter for Clara to find. Small, silent gifts. The blizzard hit on a Thursday. It started mid-morning. The sky turned a sickening yellow. Then the snow fell like a heavy curtain. The wind shrieked. It sounded like a wounded animal tearing at the roof. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. By nightfall, they couldn't see the barn. The world ended at the front porch. Gideon bolted the heavy oak door. He dragged an extra rug over the threshold to block the draft. He stoked the fire until the iron stove glowed a dull cherry red. They sat together in the quiet. The storm raged outside. Inside, it was safe. Then they heard the sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a dull, rhythmic thud. Down low, near the bottom of the front door. Thud. 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 Clara looked up from her book. Her heart skipped a beat. Gideon was already moving. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He didn't ask who was there. Nobody traveled in a storm like this unless they were dying. He threw the deadbolt. He pulled the heavy door open. The wind blasted into the room. It brought a swirl of blinding white snow. And it brought a body. A small shape fell forward onto the braided rug. Gideon slammed the door shut against the storm. He dropped to his knees. It was a boy. It was Toby, the 10-year-old orphan who swept floors for the blacksmith in Oakhaven. The blacksmith was a vicious drunk. Toby had a black eye the last time Clara saw him in town. Toby was completely still. He wore a thin, ragged wool coat, no gloves. His boots were wrapped in burlap sacks. His lips were a terrifying shade of blue. Snow was crusted in his eyelashes. "Dear God," Clara breathed. She dropped her book. She ran to the kitchen. "I'll get warm water. Blankets." Gideon worked fast. His massive hands were surprisingly gentle. He stripped the frozen, wet coat off the boy. He pulled off the ruined boots and the icy burlap. The boy's skin was pale and freezing to the touch. His breathing was shallow. A faint, rattling sound. Clara ran back with 2 heavy wool blankets. She draped them over the boy. Gideon shook his head. He signed quickly with his hands. "Not enough. He needs heat. Now." Gideon stood up. He unbuttoned his own heavy canvas coat. He pulled off his thick flannel shirt. He stripped down to his thermal undershirt. He sat down on the rug right in front of the glowing wood stove. He pulled the freezing boy into his lap. He wrapped his massive, muscular arms around the child. He pressed Toby's back flat against his own broad chest. Clara quickly wrapped the heavy blankets around both of them. She sealed them in a cocoon of wool and body heat. Gideon sat perfectly still. He closed his eyes. He focused on breathing slow and deep, sharing his life, sharing his warmth, a giant cowboy holding a broken, frozen bird. Clara sat beside them. She rubbed Toby's bare feet. She watched the boy's chest. An hour passed. The wind hammered the roof. Slowly, the color began to return. The blue faded from Toby's lips. His breathing grew deeper. He twitched. A violent shiver ripped through his small body. "It's working," Clara whispered. "He's warming up." Toby groaned. His eyes fluttered open. He looked confused. He saw the fire. He felt the heavy blankets. Then he realized he was trapped against a massive, immovable chest. He panicked. He tried to thrash away. "Easy," Clara said softly. She reached out. She stroked his messy, damp hair. "You're safe, Toby. You are safe." Toby looked at her. He stopped struggling. He looked up at the giant holding him. Gideon looked down. He gave the boy a gentle, reassuring nod. He loosened his grip just enough to let the boy breathe easier, but kept him close to the heat. "I ran away," Toby whispered. His voice was hoarse. His teeth chattered. "He was going to beat me again. I tried to make it to the next town. The snow came too fast." "Hush now," Clara said. "Don't speak. Just rest." Toby looked around the small, warm room. He looked at the gentle giant who was acting as his human furnace. He looked at Clara. "Why?" Toby asked. A tear slid down his dirty cheek. "Why did you let me in? I don't got no money. I ain't your kin. Nobody cares about me." Clara felt a sharp ache in her chest. She looked at Gideon. Gideon was watching her. He yielded the floor to her. She knelt closer to the boy. She kept her hand on his hair. She looked him straight in the eyes. "Family doesn't require shared blood, Toby," Clara said. Her voice was firm, unwavering, filled with a truth she needed the boy to understand deep in his bones. "It is human compassion that defines us, nothing else." Toby sniffled, listening intently. "The society out there," Clara continued, gesturing vaguely toward the howling storm outside the walls, "may divide people by wealth and class. They may treat you like you are worth less because you are an orphan. But inside these walls, every life is equal." She smoothed the blanket over his shoulder. "Inside this house, you matter," Clara stated clearly. "Every person here deserves to be fiercely protected. And as long as you are under this roof, no one will ever lay a cruel hand on you again. Do you understand me?" Toby looked at her. He looked at Gideon. Gideon gave a slow, deliberate nod of agreement. An absolute promise from a man who never broke one. Toby swallowed hard. He squeezed his eyes shut. He nodded against Gideon's chest. He didn't cry loud. He just wept quietly into the wool blanket. Gideon wrapped his arms a little tighter around the boy, a silent shield against the cold, against the world. Outside, the blizzard screamed. It buried the Wyoming territory in ice. But inside the stone house, the fire burned bright, and the three of them sat together on the floor. A giant, a widow, and an orphan. A family forged in the storm. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, share it with others, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The winter finally broke. It did not leave quietly. It fought the sun for every inch of ground. The ice cracked. It sounded like rifle shots in the dead of night. The snow melt turned the plains into a massive, treacherous bog. Spring in Wyoming was not beautiful. It was just wet. The roads were impassable. For 3 weeks, no one came up the trail to the stone house. They were isolated, and they were safe. But the mud eventually dried. The trail hardened. The world outside remembered they existed. It was a Tuesday morning. Gideon was gone. He had taken the wagon to the far north ridge. The winter storms had ripped down a 1/4 mile of heavy timber fencing. He would be gone until sunset. Clara was in the kitchen. She was teaching Toby how to read. The boy sat at the heavy wooden table. He held a piece of charcoal. He carefully traced the letters of the alphabet onto a scrap of brown paper. He was trying. He was safe. His bruised eye had faded entirely. Then the dog started barking. Clara stopped wiping the counter. She listened. It wasn't the frantic, high-pitched bark they used for coyotes. It was a deep, warning growl. Someone was coming up the trail. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to the window. A carriage was rolling into the yard. It was not a rancher's wagon. It was a pristine black carriage with polished brass lanterns. 2 matched gray geldings pulled it, the kind of horses that cost more than most men made in a decade. The carriage stopped. The dust settled. A man stepped out. He wore a tailored wool suit, a silk vest. His leather boots were polished to a mirror shine. He looked utterly ridiculous in the harsh Wyoming landscape. He looked like a banker who had taken a wrong turn. But Clara knew who he was. Everyone in the territory knew Silas Thorne. Thorne adjusted his expensive hat. He looked at the heavy stone house. He didn't look impressed. He looked annoyed, like he was staring at a stubborn weed in his garden. "Stay here, Toby," Clara said quietly. "Is it him?" Toby whispered. The boy's hand trembled, snapping the charcoal in half. He knew the men from town. He knew what power looked like. "Do not move from that chair," Clara ordered. Her voice was calm. It left no room for argument. She walked to the heavy oak door. She pulled it open before Thorne could knock. She stood in the doorway. She was 4 feet and 11 inches tall. She blocked the entrance entirely. Thorne stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked down at her. A thin, greasy smile crept across his face. "Mrs. Hayes, I presume," Thorne said. His voice was smooth, like oiled glass. "Mr. Thorne," Clara replied. She didn't invite him in. She didn't step aside. "I heard the rumors in Oakhaven," Thorne said. He casually peeled off his expensive leather driving gloves. "I heard the widow from the way station was playing house with the local idiot. I must admit, I didn't believe it." Clara's jaw tightened. She kept her face blank. "State your business." Thorne chuckled. It was a dry, hollow sound. "Direct. I appreciate that. I don't like wasting time." He climbed the 3 wooden steps. He stood on the porch. He tried to look past her into the house. Clara shifted her stance, blocking his view. Thorne looked back down at her. His smile faded. "This land," Thorne said, tapping his riding crop against his polished boot, "is in my way. I am expanding my grazing operations. I need the water rights. I need the acreage. I made Vance a generous offer last year. He ignored me." "Mr. Vance is not interested in selling," Clara said flatly. "Mr. Vance doesn't know what is good for him," Thorne countered. His voice dropped. It grew harder. "He is a mute, a giant stumbling child. He doesn't understand business. He doesn't understand progress." "He understands perfectly," Clara said. "The answer is no." Thorne sighed. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored coat. He pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. He tossed it casually. It landed with a heavy thud on the wooden porch right at Clara's worn leather boots. "There is $500 in that envelope," Thorne said. Clara looked at the envelope. $500. It was a fortune. It was enough to buy a house in a civilized city back east. It was enough to start over. Completely. "Pick it up, Mrs. Hayes," Thorne coaxed softly. "Pack your bags. Take the stagecoach tomorrow morning. Leave this miserable dirt patch. You are an educated woman. You don't belong out here. Why is a tiny, smart widow wasting her life with a dumb, mute beast?" The wind whistled through the porch eaves. Inside the house, Clara could hear Toby holding his breath. She looked at the money on the floor. Then she looked up at Silas Thorne. She didn't feel fear. She didn't feel temptation. She felt a cold, blinding fury. She leaned down. She picked up the heavy envelope. Thorne smiled. He thought he had won. Men like Thorne always thought they had won the moment money touched a hand. Clara didn't open the envelope. She didn't weigh it. She threw it. She threw it as hard as she could, right at Thorne's chest. The heavy paper slapped against his expensive silk vest and fell into the mud at the bottom of the stairs. Thorne gasped. He stepped back in shock. Clara stepped forward. She stood at the edge of the porch looking down at the cattle baron. Her voice rang out like a hammer striking an anvil. "Mr. Thorne, you may use your money to buy politicians and steal land," Clara said. Her words were sharp, precise, dripping with absolute contempt. "But you cannot buy respect." Thorne stared at her. His face turned an ugly shade of red. "You call him a beast," Clara continued, her voice rising, demanding he hear every single word. "You call him dumb. But he possesses more humanity than your entire bloodline. He gave me shelter when men like you would have sold me. He gave a freezing child warmth, while men like you let orphans starve in your streets. She pointed a finger straight at his chest. Human dignity cannot be priced in gold, Clara shouted. The words echoed across the empty yard. You believe everything is a transaction. You believe everyone has a price, but you are wrong. Our loyalty, our honor, and our basic human rights are not for sale, not to you, not to anyone. Thorne stood in the mud. His polished boots were ruined. His pride was bruised. He glared at the tiny woman on the porch. He looked at the envelope of cash lying in the dirt. He didn't pick it up. You are making a terrible mistake, little widow, Thorne hissed. The smooth veneer was gone. Only the venom remained. You think that giant can protect you? When I am done with him, he won't even have a grave. Get off this property, Clara said. I will be back, Thorne promised. He turned on his heel. He climbed into his carriage. And next time, I won't be offering money. I'll be bringing the sheriff. He whipped the horses. The carriage tore out of the yard. It left a cloud of dust and churning mud in its wake. Clara stood on the porch until the carriage disappeared over the horizon. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the adrenaline, from the sheer, unadulterated anger. She turned around. She walked back inside. She closed the heavy oak door. Toby was standing by the table. His eyes were wide. He had heard every word. He had watched the Baron cower before the widow. He's gonna come back, Toby whispered. Let him, Clara said. She walked to the wash basin. She splashed cold water on her face. We won't run. Hours later, the sun dipped behind the mountains. Gideon returned. He drove the wagon into the yard. He was covered in sweat and sawdust. He unhitched the team. He walked up the porch steps. He stopped. He looked down at the mud. The heavy envelope was still lying there, soaked in dirty water. He picked it up. He opened it. He saw the thick stacks of greenbacks. He walked inside. He placed the wet envelope on the heavy wooden table. He looked at Clara. His eyes asked the question his voice refused to speak. Silas Thorne, Clara said simply. She set a plate of hot food in front of him. He offered it to me to leave, to convince you to sell. Gideon looked at the money. $500. He looked at her. He knew what she had chosen. He knew she had thrown it back. He didn't reach for his chalkboard. He didn't write a thank you. He reached out. He placed his massive, calloused hand gently over hers. He held it there, a silent, unbreakable vow. The cattle baron had declared war, but the giant and the widow were ready. The mud dried into dust. The summer sun was a hammer. It beat down on the Wyoming territory without mercy. June passed in a blistering haze. July brought no rain. The prairie grass turned brittle and brown. The heat was suffocating. Gideon worked shirtless. His massive back was slick with sweat. He hauled water for the horses. He hauled water for the few head of cattle they kept. Then the water stopped. It happened on a Thursday morning. Clara lowered the heavy wooden bucket into the stone well. She listened for the familiar splash. It never came. Instead, she heard a hollow scraping sound, wood against dry rock. She pulled the rope up. The bucket was empty. A layer of dry, gray dust coated the bottom. The well had gone dry. It was a death sentence out here. Without water, the horses would die in 3 days, the cattle in 2. They would have to pack up and leave. They would lose the ranch. Clara walked to the barn. She found Gideon, and she didn't speak. She just handed him the empty, dusty bucket. Gideon looked into it. His jaw tightened. He didn't panic. Panic was a waste of energy. He walked to the tool shed. He grabbed a heavy iron pickaxe. He grabbed a short-handled shovel. He walked to the well. He tied a thick hemp rope to the heavy timber crossbeam above the well. He tied the other end around his massive waist. He stepped over the edge. He rappelled down into the dark, narrow shaft. 30 feet down. It was cramped. The air was stale. Gideon had barely enough room to swing the short-handled shovel. Clara stood at the top. She operated the hand-crank pulley. Clank. The sound of metal hitting stone echoed up the shaft. "Haul!" Gideon's voice boomed up from the dark. Hoarse, rough. Clara gripped the wooden handle. She threw her entire body weight into it. She cranked the pulley. The heavy bucket of shattered rock and dry dirt slowly rose to the surface. She dumped it. She lowered the empty bucket back down. They did this for hours. The sun climbed higher. The heat was blinding. Clara's hands blistered. The blisters popped. She wrapped her hands in torn rags and kept cranking. Down in the hole, Gideon swung the pickaxe. Clank, clank, clank. Every strike jarred his bones. The rock at the bottom of the well was unnaturally hard. It wasn't the usual sandstone or shale. It was dense, heavy. He wiped the sweat from his eyes. He swung again. Crack! The pickaxe didn't bounce. It bit deep. The stone sheared away. Gideon dropped to his knees. The air was thick with rock dust. He reached into the rubble. He pulled out a chunk of stone the size of a melon. It was heavy, much heavier than normal rock. He ran his dirty thumb across the broken face of the stone. Underneath the gray dust, it gleamed. A dull, metallic shine. Dark veins ran through the rock like frozen lightning. It wasn't water. It was silver, raw, unprocessed, undeniably rich silver ore. A massive vein of it, running right beneath their feet. Gideon stared at the rock. In the dark of the well, everything suddenly made sense. He loaded the heavy rock into the bucket. "Haul!" he yelled. Clara cranked the handle. The bucket was twice as heavy this time. Her muscles burned. She hauled it over the stone lip of the well. She looked inside. She expected wet dirt. She saw the shining, heavy stone. Gideon climbed up the rope hand over hand. He vaulted over the edge. He was covered in gray dust. He looked like a statue brought to life. He picked up the heavy rock. He held it in the sunlight. Clara walked closer. She touched the dull, shining metal. "Is that—" she started. "Silver," Gideon's rough voice confirmed. Clara stared at the rock. Then she looked at the horizon, toward Oakhaven, toward the empire of Silas Thorne. "He didn't want the water rights," Clara whispered. Her mind raced. The pieces slammed together. "He didn't want the grazing land, the town mocking you, the isolation. It was all a cover." Gideon nodded slowly. "He knew," Clara said, her voice rising with sudden sharp clarity. "Thorne ran the original land surveys before you bought this plot. He found the vein, but you bought the deed before he could file a mineral claim. He's been trying to chase you off ever since. If you abandon the land, or if he evicts you, the claim defaults back to the territory, and he buys it for pennies." It was a corporate land grab, driven by pure, unadulterated greed. Gideon looked at the silver in his hands. It wasn't a blessing. It was a curse. It was a target painted on their backs. Men like Thorne would slaughter an entire town for a vein this thick. He raised his arm. He prepared to throw the rock back down the dry well, to bury it, to pretend they never found it. "Stop!" Clara's hand grabbed his wrist. She was tiny, but her grip was like iron. Gideon looked down at her. "Do not throw that away," Clara commanded. She didn't look scared. She looked like a general preparing for war. She turned and marched toward the house. "Bring the rock, Gideon. Wash your hands. We have work to do." Gideon followed her inside. Clara didn't go to the kitchen. She went to the heavy wooden chest at the foot of her bed. She threw the lid open. She dug past the quilts. She pulled out a heavy, leather-bound book, then another, and another. They were her late husband's law books, federal statutes on homesteading, territorial mining rights, property injunctions. She carried the heavy stack to the dining table. She dropped them with a loud thud. She pulled out a fresh bottle of ink, a sharp quill, a stack of clean parchment. Gideon stood by the table. He set the silver ore down. He watched her frantically flip through the dense, tiny print of the legal texts. He reached for his chalkboard. "What are you doing?" Clara looked up. Her eyes were burning with a fierce, brilliant light. "I am writing a federal injunction," Clara said. She dipped the quill in ink. "I am drafting a letter to the United States Department of the Interior and the Territorial Marshal in Cheyenne." Gideon frowned. He shook his head. Thorne owns the local judge. I don't care about the local judge, Clara said. She began to write. Her handwriting was fast, sharp, and aggressive. We are going over Thorne's head. We are filing a preemptive mineral rights claim and a demand for a federal audit on Thorne's survey records. Gideon watched her pen fly across the page. He felt a sudden, deep surge of fear. Not for himself, for her. He reached out. He placed his massive hand over the parchment, stopping her pen. He looked at her. His eyes pleaded with her. This is dangerous. He will kill us. Clara put the pen down. She placed her small hands on top of his massive, scarred fingers. She held his gaze. She didn't blink. The law was created to shield the weak from the tyranny of the strong, Clara said. She spoke the words slowly, ensuring they carried the weight of absolute truth. It is the only weapon that levels the field between a giant like Thorne and people like us. Gideon stared at her. If we suffer injustice in silence, Clara continued, her voice echoing in the quiet stone house, we become accomplices to evil. We allow men like Thorne to believe that human beings are disposable. She squeezed his hand. We are fighting today, Clara stated, her voice ringing with unshakable conviction. Not just for this dirt, not just for this silver, but for the equal rights of every person who has been trampled by men like Thorne. If we run now, he will do this to the next family, and the next. We draw the line here. Gideon looked at the tiny woman sitting across from him. She weighed 90 pounds soaking wet. She had no gun. She had no physical strength. But as she sat behind that stack of law books, armed with a quill and a bottle of ink, she was the most terrifying, formidable creature he had ever seen. Gideon slowly pulled his hand away from the paper. He picked up the silver ore. He carried it to the mantelpiece. He set it down. A monument, a declaration of war. He walked back to the table. He pulled out a chair. He sat down beside her. Clara smiled, a fierce, dangerous smile. She picked up the quill, and she began to write. Oak Haven was boiling. It was high noon. The sun beat down on the dusty main street. The air was thick, heavy. It felt like holding your breath before a thunderstorm. Gideon drove the wagon into town. Clara sat beside him. Her leather satchel rested on her lap. Inside were the federal injunctions, the letters to the territorial marshal, the legal fires she was about to light. They pulled up to the telegraph and post office. Gideon set the brake. He didn't move to step down. He looked at the street. The street was full. Men were stepping out of the saloon. Men were coming out of the mercantile. They gathered on the wooden boardwalks. They crossed their arms. They watched the wagon. Then the crowd parted. Silas Thorne walked down the center of the dirt street. He wasn't wearing his tailored suit today. He wore a long canvas duster. He wore a gun belt. Beside him walked Sheriff Miller. The sheriff looked nervous. Thorne looked like a man who owned the world. Stay in the wagon, Gideon signed quickly with his hands. Clara shook her head. Not today. She climbed down. She held her satchel tight. Gideon stepped down beside her. He towered over the street, a mountain of muscle and scars. Thorne stopped 10 feet away. The crowd formed a half circle around them, trapping them against the wagon. Well, Thorne said. He smiled his greasy, hollow smile. Saves me a trip out to the dirt patch. I have some paperwork for you, Vance. Sheriff Miller stepped forward. He cleared his throat. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. Gideon Vance, the sheriff said. His voice wavered. He didn't look Gideon in the eye. By order of the county judge, your claim to the North Ridge property is hereby revoked. The land is forfeit. You have until sundown to vacate. The crowd murmured. A few men chuckled. Clara felt her blood run hot. On what grounds? She demanded. Thorne didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Gideon. The original survey was flawed. The county has reassigned the deed to a proper, productive agricultural enterprise, namely, mine. It was a lie. A bold, naked lie. Thorne had bought the judge. He had bought the sheriff. "You can't do this," Clara said. "It's already done, little widow," Thorne sneered. He pointed a leather-gloved finger at Gideon. "Now I want this dumb beast off my property by tonight, or the sheriff here will arrest him for trespassing. And if a giant, violent mute resists arrest, well, accidents happen." The threat hung in the hot air. The men in the crowd stepped closer. They smelled blood. They wanted a show. "Look at him," a ranch hand mocked from the back. "He don't even understand what the sheriff said. Dumb ox." "Make him sign the eviction, Thorne," another man yelled. "See if the beast knows how to hold a pen." Laughter erupted. Cruel. Ugly. It bounced off the false front buildings. Gideon didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Thorne. Gideon's jaw locked. The muscles in his massive neck bulged. His hands slowly curled into fists. They were the size of anvil heads. He took a slow, heavy breath. He was going to fight. He knew he couldn't win against 20 armed men. He knew he would die in this dusty street. But he was going to snap Silas Thorne's neck before he went down. He was going to buy Clara the time to run. He took a step forward. Clara moved faster. She stepped right in front of him. She was 4 feet and 11 inches tall. She barely reached the center of his chest. But she planted her boots in the dirt. She threw her arms out wide, pushing backward against his massive stomach. "No," Clara ordered. She didn't look back at him. She stared straight at Thorne. She opened her satchel. She pulled out the thick stack of legal papers. She didn't hand them to the sheriff. She threw them. The papers hit Thorne in the chest. They scattered into the dirt. "What is this nonsense?" Thorne hissed. "That," Clara said, her voice ringing out like a cracked whip, "is a federal injunction, filed under the United States Homestead Act, and a formal demand for an audit of your mining claims by the Department of the Interior." The crowd went dead silent. Thorne stared at the papers in the dirt. The word federal made the sheriff physically take a step back. "You laugh at him because he doesn't speak," Clara yelled. She turned her body, addressing the entire crowd of mocking men. Her voice shook with absolute fury, but her words were crystal clear. She made sure every single man in Oakhaven heard her. "You call him a beast," Clara shouted. "But it was his dumbness that gave a widow sanctuary when your town tried to sell me to a brothel. It was his dumbness that fed a freezing orphan while you let that child starve in your alleys." She pointed a shaking finger at Silas Thorne. "You think power is a piece of paper signed by a corrupt judge," Clara stated. "You think you can buy a man's dignity the way you buy your cattle. But you are wrong. Respect is not something you can steal with a tin badge or buy with dirty money. It is built entirely on human decency." She stepped closer to Thorne. The cattle baron actually flinched. "Every human being has a right to stand equal under the law," Clara declared, speaking the philosophy of her late husband with the fire of a warrior. "And if you try to take his land, you will not be fighting a mute cowboy. You will be fighting the federal government of the United States. And you will be fighting me." Silence. The wind blew a cloud of dust down the street. No one laughed. No one mocked. They stared at the tiny woman in the black dress. She had just publicly castrated the most powerful man in the territory, with nothing but words. Thorne's face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. His pride was broken. In front of the town he owned. "You miserable little—" Thorne lunged. He reached out to grab Clara by the throat, to throw her to the dirt, to silence her. His hand never reached her. A shadow fell over Silas Thorne. Gideon's massive hand shot out. He didn't punch Thorne. He didn't draw a gun. He simply grabbed Thorne by the front of his heavy canvas duster. He lifted the cattle baron clean off the ground. Thorne gasped. His boots dangled in the air. His eyes bugged out in terror. Gideon held him there for one long, terrifying second. Then he tossed him. He threw the grown man backward like a sack of empty flour. Thorne crashed into the dirt, rolling twice before hitting the wooden trough. Gideon stepped around Clara. He placed himself firmly between her and the entire town. His massive frame completely shielded her. Sheriff Miller dropped his hand to his gun. The hired men reached for their holsters. Gideon didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands. He stared at the mob. He pulled a deep, rattling breath into his chest. His throat worked. The scarred muscles strained. And for the second time in his life, the giant spoke. His voice didn't crack this time. It boomed. It rolled down the street like thunder off the mountains. Deep, terrifying, absolute. Mine. One word. My land. My home. My woman. The word hit the crowd with physical force. Sheriff Miller slowly, carefully moved his hand away from his gun. The hired men stepped back. Nobody wanted to die today. And looking into Gideon Vance's eyes, they knew whoever drew a weapon first was going to die horribly. Thorne scrambled up from the mud. He was gasping for air. He looked at the giant. He looked at the tiny widow standing safely behind him. He didn't say a word. He turned and limped toward the saloon. Gideon watched him go. He looked at the silent crowd. Then he turned to Clara. He offered her his hand. Clara took it. Her small fingers vanished inside his massive grip. He helped her into the wagon. He climbed up beside her. He took the reins. They drove out of Oakhaven. They left the town in stunned, absolute silence. Thorne didn't wait for the federal marshals. He didn't wait for the law. Cowards never do. It happened 3 nights later. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds. The Wyoming prairie was pitch black. The air was dry, brittle. The summer drought had turned the grass to kindling. Clara woke up coughing. The air in the bedroom was thick. It smelled sharp, acrid. She sat up, her eyes watered. She looked toward the window. The sky outside wasn't dark. It was glowing, a violent, churning orange. "Gideon!" she screamed. She ran into the main room. Gideon was already up. He was pulling on his boots. His face was grim, lit by the horrific glow pouring through the window panes. "Fire," he signed quickly. "Barn, the grass." They ran out the heavy oak door. The heat hit them like a physical blow. The world was burning. Thorne's men had soaked the dry prairie grass in kerosene. They had thrown torches into the hayloft of the barn. A wall of fire swept across the north ridge, driven by the relentless Wyoming wind. It was a nightmare of noise. The roar of the flames sounded like a rushing river. The horses in the barn were screaming. High-pitched, terrified shrieks. "The horses!" Clara yelled. Gideon was already running. He grabbed a heavy woolen blanket from the porch. He dipped it into the water trough, soaking it. He threw it over his head and shoulders. He charged right into the burning barn. Clara ran to the water pump. She grabbed buckets. But the pump was painfully slow. The heat singed her eyebrows. The smoke choked her lungs. A minute later, Gideon emerged from the smoke. He was dragging 2 terrified horses by their halters. His shirt was smoking. He slapped the horses hard on their rumps, sending them galloping out of the open gate away from the fire. He turned back to the barn. "No!" Clara screamed. "It's too far gone!" The roof of the barn collapsed in a shower of brilliant, deadly sparks. The fire jumped. The wind caught the embers and hurled them across the yard. They landed on the wooden scaffolding Gideon had built over the dry well, the structure where they had found the silver. The dry pine scaffolding caught instantly. The flames raced up the ropes. They ate through the thick timber crossbeams. Gideon and Clara watched in horror as the heavy wooden structure groaned. The fire weakened the supports. The heavy iron pulley, the thick ropes, and the burning timber all gave way at once. With a deafening crash, the entire structure collapsed down into the narrow stone well. The impact shattered the stone lip. The dry earth around the well caved in. Tons of rock, burning wood, and heavy dirt poured down the shaft. A massive plume of dust and smoke shot up into the air. The well was gone. The shaft was buried. The silver vein was sealed under 30 feet of impenetrable rubble. Silas Thorne had destroyed his own prize just to ruin them. Then the wind shifted. The sparks blew toward the stone house. The roof was slate, but the front porch was dry wood. The steps caught fire. "The house!" Clara yelled. Gideon ran to the trough. He grabbed buckets. He threw water on the porch. Clara looked at the open front door. Smoke was pouring inside. She thought of the heavy canvas bag sitting on the kitchen table, the bag of silver ore they had brought up. It was worth hundreds of dollars. It was their safety net. She thought of the back bedroom, Gideon's desk. She didn't hesitate. She pulled her apron up over her nose and mouth. She ran past Gideon. She ran straight up the burning steps and into the house. "Clara!" Gideon's voice tore out of his throat, raw and panicked. The smoke inside was blinding. It burned her eyes. She dropped to her knees, crawling under the thickest layer of black smoke. She scrambled past the kitchen table. She ignored the bag of silver. She crawled into Gideon's small bedroom. The heat was suffocating. She reached up. She blindly felt the top of his wooden desk. Her fingers brushed leather. She grabbed the heavy stack of journals. 3 thick books, 5 years of his thoughts, his guilt, his soul. She clutched them tightly to her chest. She turned and crawled back. Her lungs screamed for air. The smoke was getting thicker. The room was getting darker. Strong hands grabbed her by the shoulders. Gideon hauled her up. He wrapped his massive arms around her, shielding her from the heat. He carried her out the back door, away from the burning porch, and out into the dirt of the open yard. They collapsed together on the ground. Clara gasped for air. She coughed violently, her throat burning. Gideon knelt over her. He frantically patted her shoulders, checking for burns. His face was blackened with soot. He was terrified. Clara rolled over. She pushed the heavy leather journals into his hands. "I got them," she rasped, coughing black soot. "I got your voice." Gideon stared at the books. He looked at the burning porch. He knew the silver was on the table. He knew she had run past a fortune to save his words. He pulled the journals to his chest. He bowed his head. He pulled Clara into his side, holding her tight as the world burned around them. Dawn broke gray and quiet. The fire had burned itself out. The barn was a smoldering pile of black ash. The porch was charred. The prairie was a black, scorched scar as far as the eye could see. But the stone house still stood. Clara and Gideon sat in the dirt, exhausted, covered in soot. The sound of horses made them look up. A dozen riders came over the ridge. It wasn't the sheriff. It wasn't Thorne's men. It was Thomas. Behind him rode a dozen men from his tribe. They led pack horses loaded with timber, waterskins, and tools. Thomas rode into the ruined yard. He dismounted. He looked at the black ash. He looked at the caved-in well. He walked over to Gideon and Clara. "The earth burned what needed burning," Thomas said quietly. He looked at the spot where the silver vein was now buried under tons of rock. "The town of Oakhaven thinks you have lost," Thomas said, turning to look at them. "They think the fire took your wealth." Clara leaned against Gideon's shoulder. "We lost the silver, Thomas. It's buried forever." Thomas shook his head slowly. He looked at the two of them, sitting in the dirt, bruised but alive, holding on to each other. "Wealth and silver are just illusions born of greed," Thomas said. He spoke clearly, ensuring the lesson settled into the quiet morning air. "Men like Thorne will spend their lives chasing shiny rocks, and they will die empty. The earth reclaimed that silver to return peace to this land. That is true justice." He pointed a weathered finger at the surviving stone house. "The only thing of actual value that survives a fire," Thomas continued, "is the compassion you have given to others, and the respect you hold for yourselves. You did not run. You did not sell your dignity. You chose each other over the gold." Thomas reached down. He offered Gideon his hand. Gideon took it. The native elder pulled the giant cowboy to his feet. "Now," Thomas said, rolling up his sleeves, "we rebuild, not for silver, for a home. A year is a long time in Wyoming. It is long enough for the black ash to wash away, long enough for the prairie grass to grow back. Thicker this time, greener. The earth knew how to heal itself. You just had to give it time. It was October. The air was crisp. It smelled of pine needles. It smelled of approaching snow. The stone house stood exactly where it always had. But everything else was different. The barn was new. It was built of fresh, bright cedar. Gideon hadn't built it alone. Thomas and a dozen men from his tribe had come back. They brought timber, they brought tools. They worked side by side with the giant Cowboy. There was no talk of debts. There was no tally kept. They built a barn because a neighbor needed a barn, that was all. Silas Thorne was gone. He wasn't dead. He was in Cheyenne. He was sitting in a stuffy federal courthouse, sweating under the crushing weight of a United States Department of the Interior audit. Clara's letters had found their mark. The federal marshals had seized his ledgers. They found the bribes. They found the forged surveys. The cattle baron had tried to buy the law. He found out the hard way that a tiny widow with a bottle of ink was a lot more dangerous than a hired gun. And the silver? It was still buried, 30 feet down, under a mountain of shattered rock and burnt timber. Nobody dug it out. Nobody even tried. Gideon didn't want it. Clara didn't need it. Silver drew wolves. It drew blood. They had enough blood in the dirt already. Let the earth keep it. Inside the house, it was quiet. The good kind of quiet. Gideon sat at his new desk. It was bigger than the old one. He had built it himself. His leather journals were stacked neatly on the corner. The pages were slightly smoked at the edges, a permanent reminder of the night the sky burned. A reminder of what Clara had chosen to save when she could have saved a fortune. She had saved his voice. Gideon opened the bottom drawer of the desk. He pulled out a single piece of paper. It was yellowed, creased. It was the indentured labor contract from the way station in Laramie, $40. He ran his massive, scarred thumb over the faded ink. It felt like a lifetime ago. A different world, a different man. He had bought a woman's freedom because he couldn't stand the cruelty of the world. He hadn't expected her to save him right back. Gideon gripped the paper. He tore it, straight down the middle, then again. He tore it into tiny, useless squares. He dropped the pieces into the cold iron wood stove. Next, he unrolled a heavy piece of parchment. It was the new property deed, granted and stamped by the Federal Land Office. The borders were officially recognized. The land was secure. He picked up his pen. He dipped it in the black ink. He wrote his name on the bottom line, Gideon Vance. Then he moved the pen to the right. He wrote another name, right beside his, on the exact same level, Clara Hayes. And below it the legal designation, equal co-owner. He blew on the wet ink. He rolled the parchment up. He stood from the desk. He grabbed his hat and walked toward the front door. Outside, the afternoon sun was turning golden. Clara was sitting on the front porch. She sat on one of the wooden step stools Gideon had built for her. She had a basket of apples between her knees. She was peeling them with a small paring knife. The long, red skins curled into a wooden bowl at her feet. She looked up as the heavy oak door opened. She smiled. Out in the yard, Toby was running. He was 11 now. He had grown 3 inches. His face was filled out. The haunted, terrified look of a beaten street orphan was gone. He was throwing a stick for a stray dog he had found wandering the trail a month ago. The dog barked. Toby laughed. It was a loud, joyful sound that echoed across the valley. Gideon walked out onto the porch. He stopped beside Clara. He was a mountain, 6 feet and 5 inches of solid muscle. She was 4 feet and 11 inches, small, delicate. But when he looked at her, he didn't see someone who needed saving. He saw the strongest person he had ever met. Clara set the knife down. She wiped her hands on her apron. Gideon didn't reach for his chalkboard. He didn't carry it much anymore. He held out the rolled parchment. Clara took it. She unrolled it on her lap. She read the heavy legal print. She saw the federal stamp. Then she looked at the bottom line. She saw his signature. She saw hers. Equal co-owner. She stared at the ink. The wind rustled the dry leaves of the oak tree by the fence. "You tore up the contract," Clara said softly. Gideon nodded, once. "And you put my name on the deed." He nodded again. Clara slowly rolled the parchment back up. She set it on the wooden planks beside her basket of apples. She stood up. She stepped close to him. She had to tilt her head all the way back to look him in the eyes. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her face was serious, fierce, beautiful. "Gideon," Clara said. Her voice was steady. It rang with the absolute clarity of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. "I need you to understand something, and I need you to hear me clearly." Gideon looked down at her. He gave her his full attention. "When we met in Laramie," Clara said, "you paid $40 for me. You did it out of kindness. You did it out of charity. You saw a broken widow, and you shielded her from the wolves." She reached out. She placed her small hands flat against his massive chest, right over his heart. "But I am not broken anymore," Clara stated, "and I do not need charity." Gideon stayed perfectly still. He let her speak. "The men in this world," Clara continued, her voice rising just a little, carrying the weight of a hard-won truth. "Men like Silas Thorne. They think everything is a transaction. They think you can buy loyalty. They think you can buy dignity. They think you can buy a person's heart if the price is right." She shook her head, her eyes locked onto his. "But a true marriage," Clara said, pronouncing the word deliberately. "A genuine love. It has no room for charity. It has no room for pity. It has no room for debts." She tapped her finger against his chest. "It must be built on a foundation of absolute equality," Clara declared, "and mutual respect. I will not be your dependent, Gideon. I will not be your charity case. I am your partner. We stand on this dirt as equals, because as of today, neither of us owes the other a single thing." The words hung in the crisp autumn air. They were not just a statement. They were a manifesto. A declaration of human rights, spoken on a wooden porch in the middle of nowhere. You cannot buy respect. You have to earn it, and you have to give it freely in return. Gideon looked at the tiny woman standing in front of him. He looked at the fierce fire in her eyes. He felt her small, strong hands resting against his chest. He felt the steady beat of his own heart beneath them. He had spent years believing he was a monster, a dumb beast, a man who deserved to be buried in the mud. She had pulled him out. She had stood in front of an entire town and defended him. She had crawled into a burning house to save his soul. He didn't need to write anything down. There wasn't a chalkboard big enough in the world to hold what he felt right now. Gideon reached up. He placed his massive, calloused hands gently over her small ones. He didn't pull them away from his chest. He just held them there. He looked deep into her eyes. The tired, haunted look was gone from his face. The heavy burden of the past had finally washed away. He took a slow, deep breath. The scarred muscles in his throat tightened. He didn't struggle this time. The word didn't sound like tearing iron. It sounded warm. It sounded like a promise. "Stay," Gideon said. One word. "Stay with me. Stay as my equal. Stay as my wife." Clara looked up at the giant cowboy. The fierce, serious look melted from her face. A slow, brilliant smile broke across her lips. It reached all the way to her eyes. "Try and make me leave," Clara whispered. She didn't step back. She stepped forward. She wrapped her arms around his waist. Gideon wrapped his massive arms around her shoulders. He pulled her close. He buried his face in her hair. He held her tight, not like a fragile thing that might break, but like the strongest pillar in his world. Out in the yard, Toby threw the stick again. The dog barked. The wind blew across the Wyoming prairie. It swept over the new cedar barn. It swept over the buried silver. It swept over the long, waving green grass. The giant and the widow stood on the porch. They stood side by side. They stood as equals. They had proven to the entire western frontier a lesson that would outlast the silver and the gold. You can buy a lot of things in this world, but you can never buy respect.
As the dust settles over the Wyoming plains and the echoes of fire, loss, and defiance fade into the wind, what remains is not the story of a widow and a silent giant, but a testament to what it truly means to be human. In a world where people were measured by wealth, power, or brute strength, Clara and Gideon chose a different path. They chose dignity over submission, compassion over cruelty, and truth over silence. And in doing so, they didn't just survive the harshness of the West, they transformed it. This story reminds us that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it stands quietly in the face of humiliation, refusing to strike back. Sometimes it is a small voice, trembling but unyielding, daring to speak truth in a place ruled by fear. Gideon's silence was never weakness. It was a burden, a punishment he carried for a past he could not undo. Yet through Clara's courage and unwavering belief in justice, he learned that redemption is not found in suffering alone, but in the willingness to protect, to rebuild, and to face the truth head-on. And Clara, though small in stature and stripped of everything she once had, proved that true power lies not in physical strength, but in moral conviction, the kind that can stand against injustice even when standing alone. The value of this story reaches far beyond the Wild West. It speaks to every moment in life where we are tested, where we must decide whether to remain silent or to stand up, whether to follow the easy path or the right one. It teaches us that human dignity is not something that can be bought, sold, or taken away. It is something we carry within us, something we defend not only for ourselves, but for others who cannot yet defend it for themselves. It shows us that compassion is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength, that protecting others, even at great personal cost, is what gives life meaning. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that family is not always bound by blood. Sometimes it is forged in hardship, in shared struggle, and in the quiet moments of care between broken people. A widow, a silent man, and a lost child became something more than survivors. They became a home. And in a world that often feels cold and divided, that message matters more than ever. So as you walk away from this story, carry this with you. Be the voice when others are silenced. Be the strength when others are broken. And be the kindness that this world so desperately needs. Because in the end, it is not the gold we find, nor the land we claim, but the humanity we choose to show that defines who we truly are. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.